The note that echoed through that restaurant should have been impossible. On a rainy Thursday evening in Boston, nobody paid attention to the old piano sitting alone near the back wall of Whitmore Hall. It had been there for years. Dust gathered along its carved edges. The dark wood had faded under the warm amber lights. Most guests treated it like another piece of decoration, no different from the paintings hanging beside the wine shelves. Yet that night, one single note drifted through the room. Soft, clear, familiar. And the moment it reached Alexander Whitmore's ears, the billionaire froze. His hand stopped halfway to his crystal glass. Around him, conversations continued. Silverware clinked against fine china. Waiters moved between tables carrying plates of steak and seafood. Nobody noticed the change in his expression. Nobody except Alexander himself. Because he knew that melody. He knew it better than anyone alive. The note faded. Silence returned. Alexander slowly turned his head toward the piano. Empty. No musician. No performer. No explanation. For a brief second, he wondered if he had imagined it. After all, it had been 20 years since he had last heard those notes. 20 years since standing beside a hospital bed, listening as his father quietly hummed the unfinished melody he had spent a lifetime composing. A melody never published, never recorded, never shared with the public. The old man had died 3 days later, and the music had died with him. Or so Alexander believed. His gray eyes narrowed. Somewhere in the restaurant, someone knew that song. Somewhere nearby, a secret existed that should not exist at all. Then the kitchen doors swung open. A young waitress stepped onto the dining floor carrying a tray of sparkling water. Her name was Claire Bennett, 26 years old. Blonde hair gathered into a simple knot. White uniform pressed neatly despite the long shift. Calm eyes. Quiet posture. The kind of person most customers forgot moments after she left their table. Claire moved through the restaurant with practiced efficiency. Refill a glass. Deliver a receipt. Offer a polite smile. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would make a billionaire stop and stare. Yet as she passed the piano, something unusual happened. Her fingers brushed lightly across the polished wood. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Barely enough to make a sound. But Alexander noticed. The same note appeared again. Gentle. Precise. Intentional. His heartbeat quickened. Claire continued walking without looking back. No smile. No reaction. As if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't just touched a memory buried deep inside a stranger's life. Across the room, Alexander slowly rose from his chair. For the first time that evening, the business deal happening around him no longer mattered. The investors speaking beside him became distant noise. His expensive watch ticked softly against his wrist. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. His eyes never left Claire Bennett. Because there was only one question in his mind. How could an ordinary waitress know a melody that had supposedly disappeared from the world 20 years ago? Claire Bennett had learned long ago that the easiest way to survive was to remain invisible. Every evening at 5 o'clock, she stepped through the employee entrance of Whitmore Hall carrying the same canvas bag and wearing the same quiet expression. The security guard nodded. She nodded back. No small talk. No attention. Just another shift. Just another night. The restaurant sat inside one of Boston's oldest buildings, a place where wealthy executives discussed mergers over expensive wine and celebrated deals worth more than most families would earn in a lifetime. Crystal chandeliers glowed above polished marble floors. Soft jazz floated through hidden speakers. Everything looked elegant. Predictable. Controlled. Claire liked it that way. She tied her apron carefully and began preparing her section. Fold the napkins. Align the silverware. Check the reservation cards. Small rituals. Small routines. They kept the world quiet. Big crowd tonight. Another waitress said while carrying a stack of menus. The Whitmore investors are back. Claire glanced toward the private dining area. Through the glass partition, she could already see Alexander Whitmore speaking with several guests. Even from a distance, his presence seemed to change the room. People listened when he spoke. Managers stood a little straighter when he arrived. Employees became nervous around him. Claire simply looked away and continued polishing a water glass. She knew who he was. Everyone did. But she had never spoken more than a few professional sentences to him. Good evening, sir. Your table is ready. Can I refill your coffee? That was enough. The less attention she attracted, the better. Yet there were moments when staying invisible became difficult, especially when music was involved. As the evening unfolded, guests filled the restaurant. Laughter rose and fell beneath the warm lights. Orders moved in and out of the kitchen. Claire worked with calm efficiency, balancing trays and memorizing requests without writing them down. Most customers barely noticed her. Some never looked up from their phones. Others treated her like part of the furniture. She preferred it that way. Near 9 o'clock, she passed the old piano again. The instrument stood alone beneath a framed oil painting of the Boston Harbor. Nobody played it anymore. Years earlier, the restaurant had hosted live performances every weekend. Then the tradition faded. The piano remained. Forgotten. Waiting. Claire slowed for half a second. Her eyes lingered on the ivory keys. A strange softness appeared in her expression. Not sadness. Not regret. Something deeper. Something older. Then she continued walking. At the same moment, across the room, Alexander Whitmore was still thinking about the note he had heard. He tried returning his attention to business. It was impossible. The melody would not leave him alone. 20 years of silence. 20 years of believing it had vanished forever. And now somehow it had returned. His gaze drifted toward the piano, then toward Claire. A coincidence, he told himself. Nothing more. Yet the feeling would not disappear. Because every instinct that had helped him build a billion-dollar empire was whispering the same thing. There was a story hidden behind that waitress. And stories rarely stayed hidden forever. As Claire placed a fresh glass of sparkling water onto a nearby table, she noticed something unusual. Alexander Whitmore was watching her. Not casually. Not accidentally. Intently. The kind of look people gave puzzles they could not solve. For the first time all evening, a flicker of concern crossed her face. Then she lowered her eyes and continued working. But deep inside, she knew something had changed. And somewhere between the old piano and the billionaire's silent stare, a secret she had protected for years was beginning to wake up. Alexander Whitmore had built his reputation on seeing what other people missed. Markets shifted. Competitors lied. Opportunities hid behind ordinary details. For 20 years, that instinct had guided every major decision of his life. Yet tonight, it was not a company or an investment holding his attention. It was a waitress. The thought annoyed him. Across the restaurant, Claire Bennett continued moving from table to table with quiet efficiency. She carried plates, cleared glasses, smiled politely when spoken to. Nothing about her behavior suggested mystery. Nothing about her suggested she possessed knowledge connected to a melody that should have disappeared decades ago. And yet Alexander could not ignore what he had heard. He checked his watch. 9:23. The investors seated around him were discussing projections for the coming quarter. One of them asked a question. Alexander realized he had not heard a single word. Everything all right? A board member finally asked. Alexander looked up. Fine, he answered automatically. But he was not fine. Because for the first time in years, he felt something he rarely experienced. Uncertainty. Meanwhile, Claire sensed his attention every time she crossed the room. She never looked directly at him. She did not need to. Some stares could be felt without seeing them. The restaurant manager approached, carrying a reservation list. Claire, table 14 needs service. Of course. And do not forget the private room. Mr. Whitmore's guests requested dessert menus. Claire nodded. Professional. Calm. Yet as she walked toward the private dining area, a knot tightened in her stomach. She had spent years carefully avoiding attention. Years building a life where nobody asked difficult questions. A simple life. A quiet life. One shift at a time. One day at a time. It had worked. Until tonight. When she entered the private room, conversation paused briefly. Wealthy investors barely glanced at her as she distributed menus. Everyone except Alexander. His gray eyes followed her movements. Observing. Measuring. Searching. Claire placed the final menu on the table. Is there anything else I can get for you this evening? She asked. Alexander opened his mouth. Then stopped. He almost asked about the melody. Almost asked whether she recognized the old piano. Instead, years of discipline held him back. No, he said. Thank you. Claire nodded and left. The door closed softly behind her. One of the investors chuckled. You looked like you wanted to ask her something. Alexander forced a small smile. Just thinking. But he was thinking far more than they realized. Because a memory had returned. He could see his father sitting beside a grand piano in their family home. Late evening. Rain against the windows. Fingers moving across ivory keys. A melody unfinished. Beautiful. Private. The old man had once said something Alexander never forgot. Some songs find the people who need them most. At the time, it sounded like poetry. Tonight, it felt like a warning. Back on the main floor, Claire stopped briefly beside the old piano. The restaurant lights reflected softly across its worn surface. For a moment, she rested her hand against the wood. Her expression changed, not visibly enough for customers to notice, but enough to reveal a hidden sadness, a hidden history. Then she heard footsteps approaching. Claire looked up. Alexander Whitmore was standing only a few feet away. Neither spoke immediately. The noise of the restaurant seemed distant, smaller somehow. The billionaire studied her carefully. Claire met his gaze for the first time that evening. And in that silent moment, both understood the same thing. The questions could no longer be avoided. Claire Bennett was the first to look away. "Is there something I can help you with, sir?" she asked quietly. Her voice remained professional, calm, measured. Yet Alexander noticed the slight hesitation behind the words, the kind that appeared when someone was protecting something valuable. For a moment, he simply stood there, the old piano beside them, the restaurant humming around them, the scent of coffee and fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. Then he spoke. "Do you play?" Claire followed his gaze toward the piano. Her expression revealed nothing. Not anymore. The answer surprised him, not because of what she said, because of how quickly she said it, like someone repeating a sentence practiced many times before. Alexander glanced at the worn keys. "That sounds like a yes." A faint smile almost appeared on Claire's face. Almost. A long time ago. Before Alexander could continue, the restaurant manager hurried across the floor. His face looked unusually pale. "We have a problem," he said. "A serious one." Several employees immediately turned toward him. Conversations began spreading between tables. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The manager rubbed his forehead. "The pianist just called. His car broke down outside Cambridge. He cannot make it." Claire's attention shifted immediately. Alexander remained silent. "The charity guests arrive in less than 30 minutes, the manager continued. "The donors specifically requested live music." A hostess looked worried. "Can we hire someone else?" The manager shook his head. "Not on this short notice." The tension spread quickly. Whitmore Hall's annual scholarship gala was one of the most important events of the year. Business leaders, university presidents, major donors, local media, everyone would be there. And now the evening's featured pianist was stranded miles away. Across the room, staff members exchanged nervous glances. A musician could not simply appear out of nowhere. The manager paced beside the piano. "This cannot be happening tonight." Then one of the younger servers laughed softly. "Maybe Claire can help." Several employees chuckled. The comment was meant as a joke. Nothing more. Claire lowered her eyes and continued holding her serving tray. The manager sighed. "Very funny." But the joke did not end there. Another employee joined in. "Come on. Claire spends more time looking at that piano than anyone." More laughter followed. Harmless. Casual. The kind of teasing people forgot seconds later. Yet Alexander noticed something important. Claire never laughed with them. She simply stood still, quiet, watching the piano, watching the empty bench waiting beneath the lights. The room gradually returned to normal. Staff members resumed working. Guests continued eating. The manager disappeared to make phone calls. But Alexander remained exactly where he was. Because while everyone else had heard a joke, he had heard an opportunity. His instincts returned. Sharp, focused, the same instincts that built his fortune. He looked at Claire, then at the piano, then back at Claire. The connection felt impossible, yet the feeling would not leave him. "If someone asked you to play," he said carefully, "could you?" Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the tray, barely noticeable, yet Alexander saw it. Several seconds passed. Finally she answered, "That would not be a good idea." Then she turned and walked away. No explanation, no excuse, just those 7 words. Alexander watched her disappear through the dining room. And for the first time that evening, he became certain of something. Claire Bennett was not afraid of playing the piano. She was afraid of what might happen if she did. The gala guests began arriving 20 minutes later. Black cars lined the street outside Whitmore Hall. Umbrellas disappeared beneath the entrance canopy as donors, executives, professors, and community leaders stepped into the warm glow of the restaurant. The atmosphere changed immediately. Conversations became more polished. Smiles became more practiced. The annual scholarship gala was not simply a dinner. It was a tradition, a night dedicated to supporting young musicians who could not afford the education they deserved. Ironically, The one thing missing that evening was music. The empty piano seemed to grow larger with every passing minute. The manager checked his phone again. No updates. No replacement performer. No solution. Anxiety spread through the staff. Alexander Whitmore watched it all from his table near the center of the room. The investors had left. The gala guests had taken their places. Yet his attention remained fixed on one person. Claire Bennett moved through the crowd carrying trays of sparkling water and coffee. Calm as ever. Quiet as ever. If anyone else noticed the growing tension, she gave no sign. Then came the joke that changed everything. A wealthy donor standing near the piano lifted his glass and laughed. Well, if the musician is not coming, perhaps one of the waiters can save the evening. A few people smiled politely. Another guest pointed toward Claire. What about her? She seems serious enough to be an artist. More laughter followed. Not cruel, not malicious. Just the casual amusement of people who never imagined the possibility could be real. Claire stopped beside a table. For a moment, she simply listened. Then she continued serving drinks as though she had heard nothing. But Alexander noticed her shoulders stiffen. Only slightly. Only for a second. Across the room, the manager forced a nervous smile. I appreciate the suggestions, but we are working on a solution. The donor chuckled. Maybe she knows Chopin. More laughter. Claire lowered her eyes. She placed another glass on a table. Said thank you. Turned away. Professional. Polite. Invisible. Yet something about the moment bothered Alexander. Not because of the joke itself. Because of the assumption beneath it. The certainty that talent could only arrive wearing the proper clothes. The certainty that intelligence always announced itself. He glanced toward Claire again. She was standing near the service station now, organizing dessert plates. The piano remained only a few yards away. Silent. Waiting. Then the manager received another call. Everyone watched his face. Hope appeared for half a second, then disappeared. He slowly lowered the phone. The pianist is not coming, he announced quietly. The room fell still. A disappointed murmur spread among the guests. The gala had officially lost its centerpiece. The manager rubbed his temples. We will continue with the evening schedule. Nobody seemed satisfied. The scholarship donors exchanged uncertain looks. Several guests checked their watches. The energy was fading. Momentum was slipping away. Then Alexander stood up. Slowly. Deliberately. Every conversation nearby stopped. He buttoned his suit jacket and walked toward the piano. Not toward the manager. Not toward the donors. Toward Claire Bennett. She looked up as he approached. The entire room seemed to watch. Alexander stopped beside her. His voice remained calm. Respectful. Claire, he said, I would like to ask you one more time. Her heartbeat quickened. She could feel dozens of eyes turning toward them. Would you please play? The room became so quiet that Claire could hear the distant ticking of the grandfather clock near the entrance. Every eye was on her. Donors, executives, servers, guests. Even the manager stood frozen beside the podium. Claire looked at Alexander Whitmore, then at the piano, then back at the dozens of faces waiting for her answer. I cannot, she said softly. A few guests exchanged knowing smiles. The kind people wore when they expected exactly that response. The manager immediately stepped forward. That is perfectly fine, Claire. We will find another solution. But Alexander did not move. Why? He asked calmly. Claire hesitated. Not because she lacked an answer. Because she had too many. Memories rose without warning. Practice rooms filled with sunlight. Long afternoons spent studying sheet music. The sound of applause she had not heard in years. Promises made. Promises broken. Entire chapters of her life carefully locked away. Because some things are better left in the past, she finally replied. Alexander studied her face. There was no arrogance there. No false modesty. Only sadness. Deep and genuine. Before he could respond, one of the donors laughed lightly. Well, that settles it. Another guest smiled. Probably for the best. Playing for an audience like this requires serious training. A few heads nodded. The comments were not intended to be cruel. Yet they landed heavily in the silence. Claire lowered her eyes. The familiar feeling returned. The feeling of being underestimated before anyone bothered to know her story. She had felt it before. Many times. She simply chose not to fight it anymore. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly woman seated near the front slowly stood from her chair. Her silver hair caught the chandelier light as she rested one hand on the table. The room recognized her immediately. Eleanor Brooks, former chairwoman of the Boston Conservatory. one of the most respected names in American classical music education. She looked directly at Claire. "Young lady," she said gently, "may I ask you something?" Claire nodded. "Of course." Eleanor smiled warmly. "When you look at that piano, are you afraid you cannot play?" Claire's expression changed. "Barely. Yet enough." Eleanor saw it. So did Alexander. The older woman continued. "Or are you afraid that you still can?" The question settled over the room like falling snow. Claire felt her breath catch. For several seconds she could not answer, because the woman had somehow found the truth hidden beneath years of silence. She was not afraid of failure. She was afraid of remembering. Across the room, Alexander noticed the moisture gathering in Claire's eyes before she quickly looked away. Not tears, just emotion, raw and unexpected, the kind that appears when someone accidentally touches an old wound of the heart. Eleanor slowly sat back down. "Music is a strange thing," she said quietly. "It waits for us, no matter how far we run." The room remained silent. Nobody laughed now. Nobody made jokes. The atmosphere had changed completely. Claire turned toward the piano. The worn wood reflected the golden lights above. The empty bench waited patiently, just as it had all evening. Then, for the first time, she took a step toward it. Only one step. Yet the entire room seemed to hold its breath, because everyone suddenly sensed the same thing. The evening was about to become something none of them would ever forget. Claire Bennett stopped beside the piano. The distance between her and the bench could not have been more than 3 feet, yet it felt much farther. Around her, the restaurant remained silent. Nobody rushed her. Nobody spoke. Even the servers stood motionless near the walls. Claire looked down at her hands. Hands that had carried trays for years. Hands that had memorized dinner orders and polished silverware and folded napkins. Once, those same hands had spent 8 hours a day moving across piano keys. Once, they had belonged to someone else. Or at least that was what she had convinced herself. Alexander Whitmore watched from only a few yards away. He noticed the way Claire inhaled slowly, the way she closed her eyes for a moment, like someone standing at the edge of an old memory. Then she opened them again and looked toward Eleanor Brooks. The elderly woman smiled softly, not encouraging, not demanding, simply understanding. Claire felt something inside her begin to loosen. Years of silence. Years of running from a part of herself. Years of believing that chapter was finished. She took another step, then another. Finally, she reached the piano bench. A nervous laugh escaped from one of the guests before quickly fading. Nobody knew what was about to happen. Some expected a simple melody. Others expected an awkward attempt followed by polite applause. Nobody expected excellence. That was the truth. Claire knew it. Alexander knew it. The room knew it. Because people rarely expect extraordinary things from someone wearing an apron. Claire slowly removed the small order pad from her pocket and placed it on top of the piano. A simple gesture, yet somehow it felt symbolic, as though she were setting down one identity before reaching for another. She sat. The old bench creaked softly beneath her weight. The room grew even quieter. Claire rested her fingers above the keys, not touching them yet, just hovering, waiting. Her breathing slowed. The restaurant disappeared. The guests disappeared. The pressure disappeared. Somewhere deep inside her mind, she was no longer in Whitmore Hall. She was 12 years old again, sitting before a piano in a sunlit practice room. Hearing her instructor remind her that music was never about perfection. It was about truth. Across the room, Alexander felt his pulse quicken. Something about the scene felt strangely familiar, as if history were preparing to repeat itself. Claire finally lowered her hands. Her fingertips touched the ivory keys. One note followed, then another, then a third. The effect was immediate. Alexander's face drained of color. A crystal glass slipped slightly in his hand. Several guests turned toward him in confusion, but he barely noticed. Because those were the notes. The exact notes. The unfinished melody his father had written 20 years ago. Not similar. Not close. Exact. Every pause. Every interval. Every emotion hidden between them. The melody floated through the room like a voice returning from another lifetime. Guests who knew nothing about classical music suddenly sat frozen. Not because the music was loud. Because it was honest. Claire continued playing. Calm. Effortless. As though she had never stopped. As though the years between then and now had simply disappeared. And in that moment, Alexander realized something impossible. Claire Bennett did not merely know the melody. She knew it better than he did. The final note faded into silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as if the entire room had forgotten how. Claire Bennett remained seated at the piano, her hands resting lightly above the keys. She had not planned to play that melody. In truth, she had spent years avoiding it. Yet once her fingers touched the piano, the music had found its own way back. Across Whitmore Hall, guests stared in disbelief. The waitress they had barely noticed an hour earlier now sat at the center of the room, as though she belonged there all along. One donor slowly lowered his wine glass. Another shook his head in amazement. Several people exchanged confused looks. They had expected a simple performance. What they had witnessed felt entirely different. It felt personal. Eleanor Brooks sat perfectly still, her eyes never leaving Claire. The former conservatory chairwoman recognized something immediately. Talent could be trained. Technique could be taught. But emotional truth was rare. And what Claire had just revealed could not be learned from books or practice schedules alone. Meanwhile, Alexander Whitmore stood frozen beside his table. Every memory the melody carried had returned at once. His father sitting by a fireplace. Yellow pages filled with handwritten notes. Long evenings when music drifted through their home, while business worries disappeared for a few precious minutes. Alexander had spent 2 decades believing those memories belonged only to him. Yet somehow Claire had reached into that hidden place and brought them back to life. The applause began quietly. One person, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire room rose to its feet. The sound filled Whitmore Hall. Guests who rarely applauded anyone now stood together in genuine admiration. Claire looked uncomfortable beneath the attention. She offered a small nod and prepared to leave the bench. But before she could stand, Eleanor Brooks approached the piano. The room immediately quieted again. Eleanor stopped beside Claire and smiled. "Where did you study?" she asked softly. Claire hesitated. "A long time ago." Eleanor's smile widened. "That was not my question." Several guests laughed gently. Claire lowered her gaze. "The New England Conservatory." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Even the manager looked stunned. One of the donors blinked in disbelief. "You attended the conservatory?" Claire nodded once. "Years ago." Another guest leaned forward. "Why are you working here?" The question hung in the air. Claire did not answer immediately. Her eyes drifted toward the piano keys, toward the reflections of the chandeliers dancing across their polished surface. "Life changed," she said simply. No drama, no explanation. Yet something about the answer made the room even quieter than before. Because everyone understood there was a much larger story hidden behind those 2 words. Alexander took a step closer. "Claire." She looked up. "That melody," he said carefully. "Where did you learn it?" For the first time all evening, genuine uncertainty crossed Claire's face. Not fear, not embarrassment. Uncertainty. She glanced down at the keys again, then back at Alexander. "I did not learn it," she replied. The billionaire frowned. The room listened. Claire's voice remained calm. "Someone taught it to me personally." A strange feeling settled over Alexander's chest. Because deep down, before she even spoke another word, he already knew that whatever answer came next was about to change everything. The question lingered in the air. Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. Claire Bennett sat quietly before the piano while dozens of guests waited for her answer. Across the room, crystal chandeliers cast soft reflections over polished tables. Outside, rain tapped gently against the tall windows. Inside, every sound seemed distant. Alexander Whitmore could feel his heartbeat growing louder. "Someone taught it to me personally," Claire had said. Those words echoed through his mind. Because there should have been no one alive capable of teaching that melody. His father had guarded it carefully. The unfinished composition existed only inside a handful of notebooks stored away decades ago. Alexander took another step closer. "Who taught you?" he asked. Claire looked at him for several seconds. Her expression held neither fear nor hesitation now. Only memory. "Your father." Silence. Complete silence. Several guests exchanged confused glances. Others simply stared. Alexander felt as though the room had shifted beneath him. "That is impossible," he said quietly. Claire lowered her eyes toward the piano keys. "I know how it sounds." Eleanor Brooks remained beside the piano, watching carefully. The older woman sensed that something important was unfolding. Something far bigger than music. Alexander shook his head slowly. "My father passed away 20 years ago." "I know." Claire's voice remained gentle. I met him 22 years ago. The billionaire stared at her. Every logical explanation disappeared. Claire was 26 years old now. That would have made her only 4 when they first met. The numbers made no sense. The story made no sense. Yet the melody certainly existed. And she had played it perfectly. Claire reached into the pocket of her apron. The motion surprised everyone. From inside, she carefully removed a small folded photograph. The edges were worn from age. The colors had faded slightly. She held it for a moment before extending it toward Alexander. His hand trembled slightly as he accepted it. The photograph showed a little girl sitting beside a piano. Beside her sat an older man with kind eyes and silver hair. Alexander immediately recognized him. His father, younger than he remembered. Smiling, truly smiling. A sight that had become rare during the final years of his life. Alexander could barely speak. Where was this taken? Claire smiled faintly. A community music center in South Boston. Memories slowly returned. Not his own. His father's. Conversations he had overheard years ago, but never fully understood. The old man occasionally disappeared on Saturday mornings. He always claimed he was volunteering somewhere. Teaching. Helping. Giving back. Alexander had been too busy building his future to pay attention. Claire looked toward the photograph. My mother cleaned offices at night. We could not afford lessons. One day your father heard me touching a piano in the community center. After that, he started teaching me every Saturday. Several guests listened with growing fascination. Eleanor Brooks folded her hands quietly. The story felt both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. Claire continued. He never treated me differently because my family had no money. He only cared whether I loved music. Alexander stared at the photograph. Suddenly the melody made sense. The confidence made sense. Even the emotion in her performance made sense. Yet one question remained. One question that felt even more important. If his father believed in Claire enough to teach her personally, how had she gone from gifted student to waitress? And as Alexander looked up from the photograph, he realized Claire already knew he was about to ask. The photograph remained in Alexander Whitmore's hands. He stared at it, as though it might reveal another hidden truth if he looked long enough. Around him, the gala guests waited in complete silence. Nobody seemed interested in dessert anymore. Nobody cared about speeches or donations. The story unfolding beside the old piano had become the center of the evening. Claire Bennett slowly stood from the bench. The applause had faded. The music had ended. Yet the emotions it awakened still lingered in every corner of the room. Alexander carefully folded the photograph and handed it back to her. What happened? He asked quietly. It was not the question of a billionaire. It was the question of a son trying to understand a part of his father's life he had never known. Claire accepted the photograph and looked toward the piano. For several moments, she said nothing. Then she smiled sadly. I received a full scholarship to the conservatory when I was 17. Several guests nodded in approval. That made sense. Everything about her performance suggested exceptional training. Your father helped me prepare for the audition, Claire continued. He spent nearly 2 years teaching me. Every Saturday morning. Alexander lowered his gaze. The image felt almost impossible. His father had never spoken about it, never once mentioned Claire's name. Yet somehow he had quietly changed her life. You must have been one of their best students, Eleanor Brooks said. Claire gave a small laugh. For a while, the words carried a weight that immediately caught everyone's attention. Eleanor's expression softened. She understood that tone. It was the sound of someone remembering a dream they once loved. Claire looked across the room. The chandeliers reflected softly in her eyes. During my second year, my mother became ill. The room grew still again. She could not work anymore. The medical bills arrived faster than we could pay them. Several guests lowered their heads. They knew where the story was going. Claire continued speaking calmly. No bitterness. No self-pity. Just truth. I tried balancing classes and work. Then I added a second job. Then a third. She smiled faintly. Eventually, there were not enough hours in the day. Alexander felt something tighten inside his chest. He knew what came next before she said it. I left school. Nobody spoke. Claire rested one hand on the piano. At first I thought it would only be for a semester. Then 1 year became 2. 2 became 5. Her eyes drifted toward the old keys. And eventually people stopped asking when I was coming back. The silence that followed felt heavier than any applause. Because everyone understood the sacrifice hidden beneath those simple words. Alexander looked around the room. Many of the donors present had built successful careers. Many had overcome obstacles. Yet very few had willingly walked away from their greatest talent to care for someone else. Claire had. Eleanor Brooks stepped closer. And your mother? Claire smiled warmly this time. A genuine smile. She is doing much better now. Relief passed through the room. Several guests smiled with her. Then Claire added something nobody expected. She still asks me to play every Sunday. A few people laughed softly. Even Alexander smiled. Yet one thought refused to leave his mind. If Claire had been talented enough to earn a scholarship and devoted enough to sacrifice everything for her family, then one question remained unanswered. Why had she never returned to music after all these years? As if sensing the question before anyone could ask it, Claire slowly looked toward the piano once more. And the expression that crossed her face suggested the answer was far more complicated than anyone imagined. Claire Bennett stood quietly beside the piano while the question lingered between her and the audience. Why had she never returned? The answer seemed simple from the outside. Life had interrupted her dreams. Responsibilities had taken priority. Years had passed. Yet the truth was more complicated than that. Claire slowly ran her fingertips across the edge of the piano. The polished wood reflected the warm chandelier light. When I left school, I thought music would wait for me, she said softly. And it did. Several guests nodded. They understood that much. But Claire's eyes remained fixed on the keys. The problem was that I stopped waiting for myself. Silence settled over the room. Alexander Whitmore listened carefully. Every word seemed to reveal a piece of a story nobody had ever bothered to ask about. Claire smiled faintly. After enough time passes, people stop introducing you as a musician. She glanced toward her apron. They start introducing you as something else. The statement landed gently, but its meaning reached everyone. A donor near the front lowered his gaze. Another guest folded her hands quietly, because many of them suddenly realized how often they had done exactly that. Judged a person by the role standing in front of them rather than the story behind it. Eleanor Brooks stepped closer. And yet tonight you played beautifully. Claire laughed softly. Tonight was different. Why? Eleanor asked. Claire hesitated. Then she looked toward Alexander. Because tonight I heard a melody I thought had been lost forever. The billionaire felt a strange emotion rise inside him. For years he had believed he was the only one carrying that memory. Now he understood that someone else had been carrying it too. Across the room, the manager quietly wiped his eyes and pretended nobody noticed. Several employees smiled. The entire atmosphere of the gala had transformed. It was no longer about donations or speeches. It had become something much more human. Then Alexander reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. The movement drew curious glances. He unfolded a small piece of paper that looked worn with age. Carefully preserved. Carefully protected. There is something I never told anyone, he said. Claire looked at him with surprise. Alexander stared at the page for a moment before continuing. A week before my father passed away, he gave me this. The room grew silent once again. Alexander unfolded the paper completely. Handwritten musical notes covered the page. At the bottom sat a single sentence written in his father's unmistakable handwriting. Alexander read it aloud. If I never finish this piece, perhaps one of my students will finish it for me someday. Claire's breath caught. Eleanor Brooks covered her mouth. Even the guests who knew nothing about music felt the weight of the moment. Alexander slowly looked up. I spent 20 years believing those words were meant for someone I would never meet. His voice softened. I think my father knew exactly who he meant. He extended the page toward Claire. She accepted it carefully, almost reverently. Her eyes moved across the familiar notes. Then they stopped, because beneath the unfinished melody was something she had never seen before. A final page, a final movement, a continuation that had never been played. And as Claire stared at the forgotten music in her hands, she realized the performance everyone thought had ended was only just beginning. Claire Bennett stared at the handwritten page as though it had traveled through time to reach her hands. The paper trembled slightly, not because she was nervous, because she recognized the handwriting immediately. Every curve of every note, every small annotation in the margins. The careful style of the man who had spent years teaching her that music was not something a person performed. It was something a person shared. Around her, the room remained completely silent. Nobody wanted to interrupt the moment. Alexander Whitmore watched her expression change as she studied the final movement. First surprise, then recognition, then something deeper. Gratitude. Claire slowly looked up. He finished it, she whispered. Alexander nodded. Apparently he did. Eleanor Brooks leaned forward with visible curiosity. Can you play it? Claire lowered her eyes to the page again. She followed the notes carefully. The transitions were unmistakably his. Elegant, thoughtful, full of restraint. Yet there was something else hidden inside the composition. Something personal. A message left behind. Claire smiled through the emotion gathering in her eyes. Yes, she said softly. I think I can. The guests settled back into their seats. Nobody touched their drinks. Nobody checked their phones. The entire gala seemed to pause for a single purpose. Claire returned to the piano bench. This time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. She placed the handwritten page carefully beside the keys. Then she rested her fingers above the keyboard. Alexander remained standing nearby. For the first time in many years, he felt connected to his father not through memory, but through the present moment. The first notes emerged gently. Familiar themes returned. Fragments of the melody everyone had already heard earlier in the evening. But now the music continued beyond the place where it had once ended. The unfinished became finished. The question became an answer. The room listened in complete stillness. Some guests closed their eyes. Others simply watched Claire. The waitress they had overlooked only hours earlier now carried an entire room through a story without speaking a single word. As the composition unfolded, Alexander began noticing details hidden inside the music. Small passages his father used to play when he was a child. Rhythms that reminded him of family dinners. Harmonies filled with hope rather than sorrow. It felt less like a performance and more like a conversation reaching across decades. When the final movement arrived, the melody rose gently before settling into a peaceful resolution. Not dramatic, not grand, simply complete. The last note lingered beneath the chandeliers before slowly fading away. Silence followed. Then something remarkable happened. Nobody applauded immediately. For several seconds the room remained perfectly still, because applause felt too small for what they had just experienced. Finally, Eleanor Brooks stood. Then another guest. Then another. Within moments the entire room rose to its feet once more. This time the applause seemed endless. Claire looked down, overwhelmed by the attention. Yet when she glanced toward Alexander, she saw something unexpected. The billionaire was smiling. Not the polite smile used at business dinners. Not the confident smile seen in magazine interviews. A genuine smile. The kind that only appears when something lost has finally been found. Long after the applause faded, people remained standing. Not because they were waiting for another performance. Because they were reluctant to leave the feeling that had settled over Whitmore Hall. For one evening, titles had stopped mattering. Wealth had stopped mattering. Status had stopped mattering. What remained was something simpler. Something human. Claire Bennett slowly rose from the piano bench. The handwritten music still rested beside her. The final gift from the teacher who had believed in her before anyone else did. As guests began approaching, many offered congratulations. Some thanked her for the performance. Others simply shook her hand. Yet the compliments seemed almost secondary. The real change had already happened. They no longer saw a waitress standing beside a piano. They saw Claire. The person. The musician. The woman whose quiet strength had carried her through years of sacrifice without bitterness. Across the room, Alexander Whitmore stood watching. The old photograph remained fresh in his mind. So did the realization that his father had spent part of his life investing not in businesses, but in people. Quietly. Without recognition. Without publicity. The lesson struck him harder than any boardroom speech ever had. Eventually, he walked toward Claire. The crowd respectfully stepped aside. Claire looked up and smiled. Alexander returned the smile. "Thank you," he said. 2 simple words. Yet they carried everything he could not fully express. Gratitude for the music. Gratitude for the memories. Gratitude for allowing him to discover a side of his father he had never known. Claire glanced toward the piano. "Your father changed my life." Alexander nodded. "It sounds like you changed his too." For a moment neither spoke. Then Alexander reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded document. "The scholarship fund from tonight exceeded every expectation," he said. "But I would like to add something." Claire looked puzzled. Alexander handed her the paper. She opened it carefully. Her eyes widened. It was an official proposal establishing a new annual scholarship. The Arthur Whitmore Music Fellowship. Full tuition support for gifted students facing financial hardship. Claire looked up in surprise. Alexander. He gently shook his head. My father believed talent should never disappear because life became difficult. His eyes moved toward the piano. I think he would want this. Emotion filled Claire's expression. Not because of the money, because of what it represented. A door opening for someone else. A chance she knew could change a life. Months later, the fellowship became one of Boston's most respected music scholarships. And every year, when new recipients were announced, one tradition remained unchanged. Claire Bennett attended the ceremony, not as a waitress, not as a guest, but as a mentor, a reminder that extraordinary people often hide in ordinary places. Back at Whitmore Hall, the old piano still stood beneath the chandeliers. The wood was still worn. The bench still creaked softly. Yet everyone who worked there remembered the evening when a quiet woman sat down and reminded an entire room of something easy to forget. You cannot measure a person by the uniform they wear. You cannot measure a dream by the time it spends waiting. And you should never assume that someone standing quietly has nothing remarkable to say, because sometimes the most extraordinary people are simply waiting for the world to listen. And if this story reminded you of someone who carried their talent with quiet dignity, or if it made you believe a little more in second chances, share your thoughts below. Stories like these survive because people choose to pass them on. And perhaps the next person who needs to hear one is already listening.